Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from Anti-War.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, November 28th, 2024. All right, first thing, just a reminder that this is the last show of the week. I'm going to be taking off some time during Thanksgiving Day to go eat, and I'm going to do some writing. We'll update the page, but I'm not going to put out the show Thursday night for Friday. So I hope everyone has a good Thanksgiving, has a good weekend. If you have a long weekend, I hope you enjoy it. So to get into the news here, the first thing I want to mention, this is a little out of order, is that for now, it looks like the ceasefire in Lebanon has held relatively well. There's been some fire and some injuries. We'll get into that in another story. But for the most part, there hasn't been any heavy Israeli strikes and no Hezbollah rocket fire, as far as I know, at northern Israel. So we'll get more into Lebanon. But the first story that we have at the top of antiwar.com today, this is something that I think is truly evil. The U.S. is pressuring Ukraine to draft 18-year-olds. So the White House is pressuring Ukraine to increase the size of its military by lowering the minimum age of conscription from 25 to 18. A senior Biden administration official told the AP that the outgoing administration wants Ukraine to start drafting 18-year-olds to expand the current pool of fighting age males. The pressure from the U.S., this comes as polling has shown. This recent Gallup poll found that the majority of Ukrainians want peace talks to end the war. And that number is much higher in the East, the people that have to live near the front line. The majority of Ukrainians want to end the war, but the U.S. is pressuring Ukraine to throw younger Ukrainian men into this meat grinder in eastern Ukraine. And National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan recently hinted that the U.S. was pressuring Ukraine to expand conscription, saying that Ukraine's biggest problem in the war was the lack of manpower. Kyle had a story on this last week. Sullivan said last Monday, quote, "Our view has been that there's not one weapon system that will make a difference in this battle. It's about manpower, and Ukraine needs to do more, in our view, to firm up its lines in terms of the number of forces it has on the front lines," end quote. So, that was a strong hint that the U.S. is pressuring Ukraine to lower the conscription age, and here we have confirmation. And also, last month, in aid to Zelensky, in aid to the Ukrainian president, said that Ukraine has been under pressure from American politicians to lower the conscription age. He said, quote, "American politicians from both parties are putting pressure on President Zelensky to explain why there is no mobilization of those aged 18 to 25 in Ukraine," end quote. Recently, back in April, so it was a few months back, earlier in the year, Zelensky signed a bill into law that lowered the conscription age from 27 to 25. And I know people say, oh, that seems old, considering the U.S. drafted 18-year-olds for Vietnam and everything. I think the thinking is that they want to conscript people that have families, that have reproduced already. But either way, conscription is bad on the face of it, but pressuring another country to conscript 18-year-old kids, I mean, it's just complete evil, especially when you see this polling that the Ukrainians want peace talks. Polling also shows that the U.S., that Americans want the U.S. to end military aid to Ukraine. And this is what the Biden administration is doing. On top of all of these insane escalations with the long-range strikes, the anti-personnel mines, now they're saying get more young men onto that front line. And this is something Lindsey Graham, who's not afraid to speak his mind, he visited Zelensky earlier this year, right before he signed the mobilization bill that lowered the conscription age to 25, basically saying you got to get more young men out on that front line. I'll read the quote here. This is what he said. This was back in March of this year while he was in Kiev. Graham said, quote, I would hope that those eligible to serve in the Ukrainian military would join. I can't believe it's at 27. You're in a fight for your life, so you should be serving, not at 25 or 27. We need more people in the line, end quote. And there's no path toward a Ukrainian military victory. That's very clear. But it doesn't matter to these people. They just want to keep this thing going. They want to do whatever they can to prevent the next administration from ending the war. And this is part of the plan. Get more people out there fighting and dying. All right, so the next one here, Trump picks a Russia hawk as envoy to Ukraine conflict. So this one is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So this is not a good sign. On Wednesday, President-elect Donald Trump tapped retired General Keith Kellogg as his envoy to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So he's going to be a special envoy to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Kellogg advocated for the Biden administration's strategy in Ukraine and even called for implementing a no-fly zone over the war-torn country. And a no-fly zone means that the U.S. and NATO would have to shoot down Russian planes, take out Russian missile systems. This is something Zelensky was pushing for in the early days of the war, and only the biggest hawks in the U.S. liked the idea. So Kellogg served in the first Trump administration. He was actually Mike Pence's national security advisor. That's who we're dealing with here. He was the national security advisor to the vice president under the Trump administration. And so Kyle put in some of the things that he said over the past couple of years during this war. In March of 2022, in an interview on Fox News, Kellogg suggested that Biden and NATO leadership were wrong to dismiss the idea of a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And if implemented, that would have required the U.S. to shoot down Russian planes over Ukraine. That means direct war with Russia. A year later, in March 2023, Kellogg endorsed Biden's Ukraine policy to Congress. He said, quote, "I believe that if you can defeat a strategic adversary without using any U.S. troops, you are at the acme of professionalism. Because letting Ukraine defeat Russia, it takes a strategic adversary off the table, and we can focus where we should be focusing against our primary adversary, which is China," end quote. So in a paper published by the America First Policy Institute in April, Kellogg and co-author Fred Fleets argued that Putin invaded Ukraine because Biden was not aggressive enough in his approach toward Moscow. Kellogg highlighted Trump's willingness to kill Russian mercenary troops in Syria in 2019. He said that Trump revitalized the NATO alliance and sanctioned the Nord Stream 2 pipelines. He listed these as examples of Trump's aggressive policies toward Russia. He said, quote, "Trump also had a Russia policy that demonstrated American strength. For example, in 2018, after the Russian mercenary Wagner Group advanced on U.S. bases in Syria, they were met with immediate and decisive action when President Trump authorized punitive airstrikes against them. Russia never retaliated against the United States over that attack, which reportedly killed hundreds of Russian mercenaries, likely because Putin did not know how Trump would respond," end quote. And then he says that in this paper that Biden's big mistake was not giving enough to Ukraine. So again, just a bad sign that this is someone Trump is appointing as a special envoy to this conflict. All right, so the next one here, Biden. Oh, actually, I left that one up from yesterday about Biden asking Congress for $24 billion more to spend on Ukraine. So the next one here, so getting into some of the Lebanon stuff, I'm actually going to go in a different order. We just had this other story at the top of the page. I switched things up, but I want to go over Jason's story first on the ceasefire status. So this article is from Jason Ditz. He wrote this up about at 1 p.m. on Wednesday. So there were pre-dawn celebrations in part of the Lebanese capital city of Beirut as a ceasefire with Israel came into effect. The hope is that this will end the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the constant airstrikes across much of the country. Just about 15 hours into the ceasefire, so again, this is when he published it, it is mostly holding. There have been some reports of Israeli troops firing on civilians, however. In particular, Israeli troops opened fire on journalists in the southern town of Qiyam, wounding several. And this is only a few miles from the Israeli border. The Lebanese army arrived in this town in the morning, and the journalists were there with them to cover the withdrawal of Israeli troops per the ceasefire. Instead, they got shot at by Israeli forces and taken to the nearby hospital. Lebanese forces have subsequently sealed all entrances to the town. So they're keeping... some Lebanese civilians have been able to return to their homes in the south, but in a lot of these towns, the ones that the IDF is still occupying, they're keeping them out. And the Lebanese army is also like setting up checkpoints to keep them out, it seems like. So Israel warned almost immediately after the ceasefire took effect that all their evacuation zones remain in effect. So Israel has also imposed a curfew across southern Lebanon, declaring travel south of the Litani River absolutely forbidden. The curfew began at 5 p.m. local time and continues through the night. It will reportedly be lifted at 7 a.m., though the evacuation zones remain. So calm is not exactly returning to northern Israel either. So the people that live in these northern Israeli towns are critical of the ceasefire, saying it's not enough. And they're advising people not to return yet to northern Israel. So, there's some bad signs here that there's a chance this thing could fall apart. But still, as I'm recording this late Wednesday night here in the U.S., it's holding for the most part. There has been some other reports of gunfire, but nothing major. But the next story here, this is where, it really shows how fragile this ceasefire is. The U.S. assured Israel that it could act against Hezbollah. So the U.S. has given Israel a letter of assurance that Israel may bomb Hezbollah in Lebanon if it deems the group is violating the ceasefire deal that went into effect early Wednesday morning. Under the deal, Hezbollah has 60 days to withdraw its heavy weapons north of the Litani River, and Israel must withdraw from southern Lebanon during that time, as the Lebanese National Army will send more troops to the area to monitor the ceasefire. A senior U.S. official told Middle East Eye that the U.S. letter assured Israel it could strike Hezbollah if the group reconstitutes its in southern Lebanon. So this is the reasons that the Israel could strike southern Lebanon. This is what the U.S. official said. I was trying to figure this out kind of all day, what exactly these U.S. assurances were. I don't think the actual letter that they gave Israel is publicly available. And this is separate from the ceasefire deal. These are assurances that the U.S. gave to Israel. But what this U.S. official is saying is that Israel could strike Hezbollah if the group reconstitutes in southern Lebanon, imports weapons, or if Israel says Hezbollah is positioning itself in a way that Israel deems a threat. So that seems like a pretty loose interpretation there. Hezbollah positioning itself in a way that Israel deems a threat. So Netanyahu claimed that he reached an understanding with the U.S. that Israel would maintain full military freedom of action in southern Lebanon. He said, quote, "If Hezbollah violates the agreement and tries to arm itself, we will attack. If it tries to renew terrorist infrastructure near the border, we will attack. If it launches a rocket, if it digs a tunnel, if it brings in a truck with missiles, we will attack," end quote. And I also saw polling among Netanyahu's Likud party. The majority are unhappy with this ceasefire deal, are against it. It gives Netanyahu more motive to break the ceasefire. So Netanyahu said that, all these ways that they'll attack. And then there was two U.S. officials who spoke to Axios. They disputed Netanyahu's portrayal of this understanding that he has with the U.S., but they also confirmed that the U.S. is giving Israel a lot of leeway, giving them a lot of justification to launch strikes. The Axios report says that while it gives Israel freedom of action to respond to threats from southern Lebanon, such as preparations for a rocket attack or building of Hezbollah outposts near the border, Israel would only be able to respond to less urgent threats like Hezbollah rebuilding military infrastructure north of the Litani River after consultation with the U.S. and if the Lebanese military did not deal with the threat on its own. So they're saying in these other scenarios, they have to go through these consultations. But again, even what they're saying, it sounds like Netanyahu has a lot of freedom to act under these assurances that he got from the U.S. And this means that the stability of the ceasefire is largely based on Netanyahu's judgment. And the Middle East Eye report noted that it's not clear if the presence of members of Hezbollah, of their military wing who live in southern Lebanon, which a lot of them live in southern Lebanon, is their presence, even if they're not armed, is that going to be enough to justify a strike? I think if Netanyahu feels like escalating this thing again, the answer will be yes. We know that they bomb Hezbollah fighters and Hamas guys in their homes when they're with their families. So I don't think that that's out of the question. So again, it seems pretty shaky, this whole thing, but let's hope that it sticks. All right, so the next one here, on to Gaza. Israel kills 33 Palestinians in Gaza in 24 hours. So Gaza's health ministry said Wednesday that Israeli attacks killed 33 Palestinians and wounded 134 over the previous 24-hour period. Strikes on Wednesday included the bombing of a school sheltering displaced Palestinians in Gaza City. If that sounds familiar, this is the second day in a row that they did this in Gaza City, that they bombed a school sheltering civilians. And, when we talk about this ethnic cleansing campaign that they're doing in northern Gaza, they initially ordered them all to go south of the Netzrim corridor, and then they focused it on the cities that are north of Gaza City. So these are displaced people from those cities that they told to go to Gaza City, and they still get bombed. So according to Wafa, at least 12 people, including women and children, were killed by the Israeli strike on the Al-Tabin school. And I should warn, this picture is not very graphic, but this is a child that was killed in the strike here. And, I talk about looking through the pictures from Reuters and the other news agencies from Gaza, and today was another particularly bad day when it came to dead children. A survivor of the strike who was sheltering at the school with his daughters and grandchildren told Al Jazeera that he thought his 8-month-old grandchild was killed in the strike, saying that the grandchild was left buried in the sand, but miraculously she survived. There was also an Israeli strike in the northern city of Beit Lahia, which has been under total siege since early October. That killed a pregnant woman and injured 5 civilians. In southern Gaza, Israeli strikes hit a crowd of people near the city of Khan Yunis, killing 2 and wounding 3 others. So the daily slaughter continues. And the next one here, North Gaza, 130,000 children are deprived of food under the Israeli siege. So the international charity Save the Children said in a press release on Monday that about 130,000 Palestinian children under the age of 10 have been trapped under an Israeli siege in northern Gaza for 50 days. The organization said that children living in North Gaza, quote, have been almost completely cut off from supplies of food, water, and medicine since October 6, 2024, when Israeli forces declared the area to be a closed military zone, with the Independent Famine Review Committee saying that famine is either imminent or likely already occurring in the area, end quote. In early October, Israel ordered the evacuation of northern Gaza and declared the area a military zone as part of this ethnic cleansing campaign. And this has been focused on Beit Lahia, Jabalia, Beit Hanun. These are the 3 cities north of Gaza City where they've been under total siege. No aid has gotten into these cities at all. I believe very limited supplies got to the Kamal Adwan hospital, but they said right after that happened, Israel bombed the place and destroyed some of it. And some aid has gotten to Gaza City, but it's like a trickle. I mean, it's compared to the levels before, it's like nothing. And Save the Children noted that the UN, quote, also warned nearly a month ago that the entire population of North Gaza governance was at risk of dying, yet attempts by aid groups to access the area have been repeatedly denied by Israeli forces, end quote. The charity said that it had been trying to deliver food parcels to northern Gaza for over 7 weeks, but the effort failed and the aid was redirected to the south. A woman named Ruba, a mother of 2 who's in northern Gaza, described her situation to Save the Children. She said, quote, I am trapped with my children under relentless bombs, rockets, and bullets with nowhere to run. My mother is paralyzed and I cannot leave her behind. My brother has been killed. My husband was taken and I don't know if he's alive. Our home was destroyed over our heads, and we survived by a miracle. With no food, no clean water, and constant fear, both my children have developed rashes and my daughter is passing blood, but there is no medicine, no help, and absolutely nothing I can do. They cry and ask me why we can't just leave, why their father isn't with us, why we can't go back to normal life, end quote. That's just one account, just one family in northern Gaza. And again, they're saying 130,000 kids under the age of 10 living under these conditions. And, I mentioned at the end of this, that letter that the Biden administration sent to Israel on October 13th, they send them a letter. They say, hey, you got to improve the aid situation. If you don't, we might do something about it. 30 days go by. It was they gave them a 30-day deadline. 30 days go by. In that 30 days, the aid situation has only gotten worse. The situation has only gotten worse in Gaza, across Gaza, not just in the north, in the south as well. The aid levels are as low as they've been. 30 days comes up and they say, we're not actually going to do anything. So there's no consequences for Israel. The U.S. weapon shipments continue to flow. And this is what the U.S. is supporting, starving children. This is something certainly for us to think about. It's going to be hard not to think about it. And we should think about it, on Thanksgiving, what our government is supporting here and enabling and funding. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. is moving forward a $680 million weapons package for Israel. So more weapons for Israel. The Biden administration is moving forward with a $680 million weapons package for Israel as the U.S. continues to fuel Israel's onslaught in Gaza. The Wall Street Journal reported on Wednesday that the administration has notified Congress of its intention to go ahead with the arms deal for Israel, which includes joint direct attack munition bomb kits and small diameter bombs. So more bombs for Israel. It's unclear how this deal will be financed. We don't know all the details, but it's almost guaranteed with the levels of aid they've been giving Israel that this is going to be funded by the U.S. The U.S. gives Israel a lot of this foreign military financing aid, and that gives foreign governments money to buy U.S. weapons. Last month, Israel signed a $5.2 billion contract with Boeing to purchase 25 F-15 fighter jets, and that deal is being financed by U.S. military aid. Just put in some of the numbers here. The Brown University's Cost of War project said in a report that came out on October 7th that in 1 year, the U.S. support for Israel cost U.S. taxpayers at least $22.76 billion, and that total includes $17.9 billion in direct military aid. So if you add that $5.2 billion, that contract for the F-15s would be added to that total, and potentially this $680 million could be added to that total as well. All right, so the next one here, and another point I made in that article, when Bernie Sanders introduced those resolutions to block a few arms sales, it was under, he justified his actions by saying U.S. military aid right now. He classified it as offensive weapons, but any weapons that you give Israel are offensive weapons, even if they're air defense systems, because it enables them to carry out aggression. But anyway, he introduced that, saying that right now these weapon shipments to Israel are illegal because there's all these laws, these foreign assistance laws that prohibit military aid to countries that intentionally block humanitarian aid, which there's no doubt Israel's doing that, and countries that commit human rights violations with U.S. weapons. Again, so much evidence of war crimes. And then there's also, Sanders didn't mention this, but there is also a amendment to one foreign assistance law that prohibits military aid to a country with nuclear weapons that has not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is Israel. So it's illegal through that way too. That's why the U.S. doesn't officially acknowledge Israel's nukes. All right, so the next one here, U.S. representatives urge Biden to pardon Julian Assange. So this is cool to see. House Representatives Thomas Massie of Kentucky, Republican, and James McGovern of Massachusetts, Democrat. Both of these guys have been great on Assange over the past couple years. They've sent a letter to President Biden urging him to pardon WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, to send a message that Biden will not target or investigate journalists and media outlets for simply doing their jobs. So they said in this letter, quote, "We write first to express our appreciation for your administration's decision last spring to facilitate a resolution of the criminal case against publisher Julian Assange and to withdraw the related extradition request that had been pending in the United Kingdom," end quote. So Assange was freed in a plea deal earlier this year after spending more than 5 years in London's Belmarsh prison while battling a U.S. extradition request. It was very exciting for me because I happened to be in Australia when that happened, and it just happened very suddenly. But, one of the few good things that I got to cover over this past year is just very exciting when that happened. But there is a problem with his plea deal. Well, first, he was indicted by the Trump administration in 2019 over classified documents leaked to WikiLeaks by Chelsea Manning. Essentially, he was indicted for exposing U.S. war crimes. And under the indictment, Assange could have faced up to 175 years in prison in the U.S. for publishing the documents, which, of course, is a standard journalistic practice. While the plea deal set him free, it required him to plead guilty to violating the Espionage Act. So Massey and McGovern said, quote, "The term of Mr. Assange's plea agreement have now set a precedent that greatly deepens our concern. A review of prosecutions under the Espionage Act makes clear that Mr. Assange's case is the first time the act has been deployed against a publisher," end quote. So they pointed to comments from Jody Ginsburg, who's the CEO of the Committee to Protect Journalists. She said, quote, "While we welcome the end of his detention, the U.S.'s pursuit of Assange has set a harmful legal precedent by opening the way for journalists to be tried under the Espionage Act if they receive classified material from whistleblowers," end quote. So Massey and McGovern concluded the letter by saying, quote, "We therefore urge you to consider issuing a pardon for Mr. Assange. A pardon would remove the precedent set by the plea deal and send a clear message that the U.S. government, under your leadership, will not target or investigate journalists and media outlets for simply doing their jobs," end quote. So this is important, and Assange's brother, Gabriel Shipton, according to Fox News, he's headed to Washington in January to push for a pardon for Assange before Biden leaves office. And he shared a link to this open letter that you can add your name to. I have the link in the story here. I'll try to remember. I'll put the link in the description of the description of the show, so you can add your name to that list. It's an open letter. It has over 25,000 names so far. So maybe this could go somewhere. Unfortunately, it's only 2 members of Congress. I wish there was more signing on to this letter, but at least it's something here. All right, so the last story here, Syria fights HTS in largest anti-government attack in years. This is from the Cradle. So Syrian troops engaged in fierce battles with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, on November 27th and heavily bombarded its positions after militants launched what has been described as the largest anti-government attack since 2020. So HTS, formerly the al-Nusra Front, which was al-Qaeda in Syria, it's headed by al-Julani, who is the quote-unquote former al-Qaeda leader in Syria. They've kind of been, they've had a nice rehabilitation from the Western media, HTS, but these are, al-Qaeda guys, basically, and they are the biggest anti-government faction. They control a good portion of Idlib. And they launched a big offensive on Wednesday with some other militant groups, these Turkish-backed groups. I read a CNN story on this, and they didn't even mention that HTS was involved in the fighting, even though they are the biggest group and they're leading this offensive. So the Syrian army said in a statement, quote, "Since the early morning hours, fierce battles have been taking place between the Syrian Arab Army and terrorist organizations that have launched the largest attack since 2020. Very violent clashes are now taking place along the western Aleppo countryside axis, and continuous raids by Syrian Russian warplanes are targeting terrorist gatherings in their supply lines," end quote. So they launched attacks in the countryside of Aleppo, Hama, and Idlib, and I believe they captured some villages in Aleppo. So we'll see how far this goes here. But this comes, after Israel's ramped up all these airstrikes against Syria. This is certainly something that, benefits Israel, is the destabilization of Syria, since Syria is an ally of Hezbollah, of Iran. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on here. But it looks like, again, the media coverage is not going to be too great if you could read a whole story and not even know that it's HTS, that it's the that's leading this offensive. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from, these are actually, we have the same viewpoints from yesterday. We kept them up an extra day because they were very good, and not as many people will probably check the page on Thanksgiving. We changed the spotlight, though. We have one from Trita Parsi at Responsible Statecraft, his analysis on the Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire. So go check that out. Let's see if there's anything else. So this is the last episode of the week. Again, I hope everyone has a good Thanksgiving, has a good weekend. Another reminder, I haven't been mentioning it enough, but everybody should go and buy Provoked, Scott Horton's new book about the lead up to the war in Ukraine, since end of the Cold War up to the invasion and after the invasion. I mean, it covers so much. Today, he's been doing like a media tour. He was on Glenn Greenwald's show, which is really cool. Dave Smith's podcast. He did a bunch of other shows today. He did a Zero Hedge debate. He was on Piers Morgan the other day. So he's just been out there, and he's just a machine. So he's gonna be just. I think the book is selling really well, and I think when he does the podcast, he's gonna release it as like a podcast series first before putting out the audiobook. I think that's gonna get a ton of attention, and so it's very, very good. Support this show, like, subscribe on YouTube, Rumble, wherever you watch. If you listen to the audio version, you could leave a rating or a review depending on where you listen. Follow us on Instagram, on X. So I'll be back in a few days. I hope everyone has a good weekend. Thanks for listening.